The saloon lamps flickered against the dark, their glow casting long shadows across boots caked with dust and spurs that clinked with every step. At the edge of the room, a boy in rags stood with eyes wide, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of scorn. He had wandered in from nowhere, carrying nothing but hunger in his stomach and hope in his gaze. But the cowboys' laughter cut sharper than knives. They sneered at his tattered clothes, mocked his trembling hands, and turned him away as though his presence itself was an offense. In a land where pride was currency, he had none to offer. The boy's stomach growled louder than the piano keys, but no one cared. Each door that slammed against him, each shove that sent him stumbling into the dust, told him he did not belong. The cowboys boasted of their strength, their victories, their cattle, but for him, there was only rejection. He tried to hold his head high, yet the weight of their ridicule dragged it lower with every insult. The Old West had always been unforgiving, but that night it felt merciless. Still the boy lingered. Though their laughter stung like lashes, he refused to vanish into the night. Somewhere deep inside, a fire flickered, faint but unbroken. He knew he carried nothing the world valued. No name, no family, no coin. But he also knew that walking away would mean surrendering to the lies they hurled at him. His eyes scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that might prove his worth, even as the jeers grew louder. And then, as the night bled into its darkest hour, the chief entered. His presence silenced the chaos, his very stride commanding more than rifles or fists ever could. The laughter faltered, the room stiffened, and even the boldest cowboys lowered their gaze. The boy, still trembling in rags, stood frozen as the chief's shadow fell across him. Every heartbeat felt like thunder in his chest, for in that moment his fate hung on a single glance. By sunrise, the impossible would unfold. The boy who had been rejected, beaten down by mockery, would hear words that no one in that saloon could have imagined. The chief, the man who carried the weight of authority and honor on his shoulders, would call him something far greater than beggar, stranger, or burden. He would call him son, and in that single word, the boy's life and the tribe's story would change forever. The chief's eyes studied the boy with a depth that seemed to pierce through the rags, the dirt, and the trembling hands. Where others saw only weakness, he saw something different, an ember of resilience flickering against the darkness. The silence in the saloon was suffocating, every cowboy waiting for the chief to dismiss the boy as they had. But instead, the man of authority took a step closer. The weight of his boots echoed in the boy's chest, and for the first time, the laughter around him turned into uneasy murmurs. The boy felt exposed, his shame raw under the chief's gaze. Memories of rejection surged through him. Nights spent alone in the cold, scraps stolen just to survive, the sting of voices telling him he was nothing. Yet here, in this moment, he stood taller than he ever had, refusing to bow his head. Something in the chief's stare demanded not submission but honesty, as if daring him to show the truth of who he was beneath the rags. The cowboys grew restless. They shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the way the chief lingered on the boy. Some scoffed, others muttered under their breath, but none dared speak aloud. Their pride told them the boy was worthless, but the chief's silence made them question what they had missed. Their mockery now fell hollow, brittle, breaking under the weight of authority. Finally, the chief spoke, his voice steady and deep. "You've been laughed at, turned away, left with nothing," he said, his words carrying across the room like thunder. "But I ask you this, boy. What kept you standing here when every hand pushed you aside?" The question cut deeper than any insult. The boy's lips parted, but no words came. His throat tightened, his heart pounded, and yet, in his silence, the answer was already there. He had stayed because something inside him refused to be broken. The chief's eyes narrowed, then softened. The cowboys leaned in, expecting dismissal, perhaps a command to throw the boy into the streets. Instead, the chief's hand lifted, not in rejection, but in recognition. For the first time, someone had looked past the rags. For the first time, the boy felt seen, not as a beggar, but as something more. And though the words had not yet been spoken, the air already carried their weight. The night stretched on, the fire in the saloon crackling as though it too waited for the verdict. The boy's chest rose and fell with sharp breaths, his body torn between fear and the strange warmth building inside. He dared not believe what seemed to linger in the chief's eyes, a possibility too great, too dangerous for his fragile hope. Yet he could not look away, drawn to the strength of the man who saw him when others refused. The cowboys whispered fiercely now, some calling it madness, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had built their world on pride, mocking anything that did not match their image of power. To accept the boy was to admit their cruelty, to confess they had been wrong. Their voices grew sharper, desperate to drown out the unease that crept into their hearts. But no matter how loud their protests became, none could overpower the silence of the chief's judgment. The chief moved closer, his shadow falling fully over the boy. "You've walked through fire, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low but unyielding. The boy's eyes welled with tears, though he fought to hold them back. He nodded once, his small frame trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of being understood. For the first time, his suffering was not dismissed, it was recognized. The chief did not see pity in him. He saw survival. The boy wanted to speak, to tell of nights spent under the stars with only hunger as his companion, of the cruel hands that had shoved him aside, of the endless days where no one had called him by name. But his words stuck in his throat. He realized he didn't need to explain. The chief already knew. Somehow, this man had seen through the silence what no one else had cared to look for, the spirit that endured when everything else was stripped away. Around them, the room grew tense. It was no longer just about the boy. It was about the tribe itself, about what kind of men they would be if they turned him away again. The chief understood this. His choice would not only shape the boy's future, but theirs as well. And as the boy stood trembling, waiting, the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the windows with the promise of a new day. The decision was near, and it would change everything. The first rays of dawn slipped through the cracks of the saloon shutters, casting pale light across the floorboards. The boy, still standing in rags, felt as though the world itself held its breath. Every eye was on him, some filled with contempt, others with unease, but none dared to intervene as the chief drew closer. The fire's glow met the sunlight, and in that fragile moment between night and morning, the boy's fate teetered like a coin in the air. The chief's hand, scarred by years of battle and leadership, reached out. It hovered in the space between them, neither commanding nor forcing, but waiting. The boy hesitated, his mind drowning in memories of rejection. Every instinct told him this was another trick, another cruel test. And yet, something in the chief's eyes, steady, unyielding, but strangely kind, pulled him forward. Slowly, cautiously, the boy placed his hand into the chief's. The room erupted in gasps. The cowboys shifted uneasily, their pride stung. For them, worth was measured in cattle, coin, and courage proven by violence. To see the chief honor a boy in rags felt like a blow to the order they had built their lives upon. Some scowled, others whispered, but none could deny the weight of the moment. The boy, who just hours before had been mocked and discarded, now stood at the center of something greater than their ridicule. The chief's voice cut through the murmurs. "This boy has endured what would have broken many of you," he declared, his tone sharp as steel. "He has been cast aside, yet he still stands. That strength is worth more than your laughter, more than your pride." His words pierced the silence like arrows, forcing even the boldest cowboys to lower their eyes. It was no longer about rags or appearances. It was about resilience, about the courage to remain unbroken when the world demanded surrender. Tears blurred the boy's vision, but he did not look away. For the first time in his life, he was not invisible. He was not the shadow in the corner, the beggar mocked for his emptiness. In that moment, he was seen, not as worthless, but as someone who mattered. And though the chief had not yet spoken the word aloud, the boy felt it echo in his chest. "Son." The morning deepened, golden light spilling into the room, as though the heavens themselves bore witness to the moment. The chief turned, still holding the boy's hand, and faced the gathered cowboys. Their silence was heavy, their pride wounded, but beneath it all was something else, shame. They had ridiculed what they could not understand, and now they stood exposed before the authority of the man they respected most. "You call yourselves men," the chief said, his voice resonant. "Yet you mocked a child who carried the weight of the desert on his shoulders. You judged him by rags while ignoring the strength it took to wear them. Tell me, what have your riches taught you that suffering has not already carved into his bones?" His words were not just for them, but for the boy, who felt their weight settle deep inside him. For the first time, his pain had meaning. It was proof of survival. The boy's heart pounded. He remembered nights when hunger had clawed at his stomach, when the cold had wrapped around his frail body like chains, when every glance from strangers carried only disdain. He had thought those nights meaningless, cruel punishments for simply existing. But now, in the chief's words, he saw them differently. They were not marks of shame, but badges of endurance, scars that had shaped him into someone stronger than the men who mocked him. The cowboys looked at one another, their arrogance crumbling under the chief's gaze. Some clenched their jaws in resentment, unwilling to admit their failure, but others lowered their heads, the truth too sharp to ignore. They realized that their laughter had not revealed the boy's weakness. It had revealed their own. They had mocked because it was easy. The boy had endured because it was necessary. And endurance, they now saw, was the truest strength. The chief placed his other hand firmly on the boy's shoulder, steadying him as though anchoring him to a new truth. "You are no longer a stranger here," he said. "By sunrise, you will not be the boy they cast out, but the son I claim as my own." The words fell like thunder, shaking the walls of the saloon and the hearts of everyone within. And for the boy, who had never belonged anywhere, those words became the beginning of a life he had never dared to dream. The boy's knees nearly buckled as the chief's words sank into him. "Son." The word struck harder than every insult, every cruel laugh, every door slammed in his face. It was a name he had never been given, a place he had never known. His throat tightened, tears stung his eyes, and for a moment he feared his legs would give way. Yet the chief's hand on his shoulder steadied him, a reminder that he was no longer standing alone. The cowboys stirred restlessly, their faces masks of disbelief. Some scoffed, unwilling to accept what they had witnessed. Others stared in silence, their arrogance unraveling as they realized what had been done could not be undone. By sunrise, this boy they had dismissed would carry the chief's name. No insult, no mockery could strip him of that. And the truth of it left them shaken. The boy looked around the room, meeting the eyes of men who had laughed at him only hours earlier. He did not see hatred anymore. He saw uncertainty, even shame. The same mouths that had jeered now pressed into thin lines, unable to form words. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. They saw him, and though they may never admit it, they respected him. The chief raised his voice once more, sharp and unwavering. "By this dawn, you will remember that strength is not found in coin or cattle. It is found in the fire that survives when the world tries to extinguish it." This boy carries that fire. The declaration hung heavy in the air, echoing louder than the rattle of spurs or the clink of glasses. No man dared to challenge it. And as the first light of the sun stretched fully across the room, the boy felt its warmth like a crown upon his head. He had walked into the night in rags, mocked and rejected, but now he stood claimed, chosen, transformed. His heart whispered the word again and again, "Son," as if afraid it would vanish, and yet knowing it was his forever. Outside, the town awoke, unaware of the storm that had passed in the saloon. The streets filled with the familiar clatter of hooves and the shuffle of boots, but within those walls, a legend had begun to take root. The cowboys dispersed quietly, their pride bruised, their thoughts unsettled. They would carry the story on their tongues, but no matter how they told it, the truth remained. A boy in rags had been claimed by the chief, and nothing could erase it. The boy stepped out into the morning light beside the chief. The air smelled of dust and promise, and for the first time, it did not feel heavy against his skin. He inhaled deeply, as though the world itself had opened to him. Every corner that once rejected him now seemed unfamiliar, transformed by the power of a single word. He walked not as a beggar, but as someone who belonged. The chief's stride was steady, his presence commanding as always, but now it carried something new, a shadow of pride for the boy at his side. He did not speak much, but he didn't need to. His silence was enough. It told the boy that he was no longer a stranger to be cast aside, but family, bound not by blood but by choice. That choice weighed more than gold. The boy felt the stares of townsfolk as they passed, eyes wide with disbelief. Some whispered, others turned away, but none dared to laugh. His rags still clung to him, but they no longer defined him. He wore something greater now, dignity. Every step he took alongside the chief carved a new truth into the dust. He was no longer who he had been. He was becoming who he was meant to be. The Old West had always been harsh, a place where the weak were devoured and only the strong survived. Yet this morning proved something different, that even in the dust and cruelty, grace could be found. The boy's survival had been his own, but his belonging came because one man had seen what others refused, and in that belonging, his life was reborn. As the sun climbed higher, the boy's steps grew steadier. His bare feet kicked up dust, but his heart carried a weight he had never known before, a weight not of shame, but of belonging. Each sound of the chief's boots beside him was like a drumbeat, marking the rhythm of a life remade. He was no longer walking behind others, no longer hidden in the shadows. For the first time, he walked with someone, his place acknowledged for all to see. The town watched in silence. Women leaned from doorways, children clung to fences, and men pulled their hats low, their eyes following the boy with a mix of awe and discomfort. They remembered the rags, the laughter, the insults. But now, as he walked under the mantle of the chief's recognition, their voices were caught in their throats. To mock him now would be to defy the man whose word carried more weight than law itself. Their silence was its own admission. The boy had been elevated beyond their scorn. Inside, however, the boy still wrestled with disbelief. He wanted to believe the word son was real, permanent, unshakable. Yet echoes of rejection lingered in his mind. Every cruel laugh, every door slammed, every hand that shoved him aside. Could one man's choice truly erase years of pain? The doubt gnawed at him, even as his chest swelled with the warmth of belonging. The chief seemed to sense the storm within him. Pausing at the edge of the main street, he rested a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "They mock you because they could not see," he said, his voice low but firm. "But blindness is theirs, not yours. You survived their cruelty, and now you carry something greater, proof that you cannot be broken." The words settled deep into the boy's chest, pressing against the wounds of the past like healing salve. The boy's eyes lifted, catching the horizon painted with golden light. For the first time, the future no longer felt like an endless road of rejection. It felt open, vast, waiting. He was no longer the child begging for scraps of recognition. He was a son, and though the title still felt fragile on his tongue, he knew it would one day become as natural as breath. That night, the tribe gathered around a great fire. Sparks leapt into the air, rising toward the stars, as voices hushed in anticipation. The chief stood tall, his presence commanding as he gestured for the boy to step forward. Every eye turned toward him, some curious, others skeptical, but none indifferent. He walked slowly, each step echoing louder than the last, until he stood in the circle of light. The boy's rags still clung to him, tattered and thin, yet under the glow of the fire they seemed less like shame and more like scars of survival. He kept his head high, though fear gnawed at his stomach. Would they accept him as the chief had, or would they reject him once more? The silence of the crowd pressed heavily, threatening to crush him, but he refused to look away. The chief raised his voice, deep and resonant. This boy was turned away, mocked by those who measured worth with laughter. Yet he remained. He endured. And by the light of this dawn, I call him not beggar, not stranger, but son. His words rolled through the gathering like thunder, striking at the pride of some and awakening the hearts of others. The title was no longer just spoken in private. It was declared before them all. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some bowed their heads, moved by the weight of the chief's words, while others clenched their jaws, unwilling to let go of their scorn. But the boy stood steady in the firelight, feeling the truth settle deep within him. It no longer mattered who doubted or who mocked. What mattered was the choice of the man who held the tribe together, a choice that could not be undone. The flames crackled higher, casting his shadow long across the ground. He realized then that he was no longer living in the shadow of rejection. He was becoming a symbol of resilience, of dignity, of belonging earned not by wealth or birth, but by surviving what others could not. And as the firelight bathed his face, he understood. The Old West would remember him not as the boy in rags, but as the son chosen at dawn. The fire burned lower, glowing embers painting the night in hues of red and gold. The boy sat quietly near the chief, still reeling from the weight of what had been spoken before the tribe. Around him, voices stirred, some filled with acceptance, others heavy with doubt. He could feel the tension like smoke in the air, but this time he did not shrink beneath it. He held his head high, because now he carried a name greater than any insult: son. Some of the cowboys muttered their discontent, insisting the chief had been blinded by pity. They scoffed at the idea that a boy in rags could ever stand as family beside the leader of their people. Yet their words, once sharp enough to pierce him, no longer held power. For every sneer, there were eyes that watched him differently now. Children who stared with curiosity, women who nodded with quiet respect, and men who could no longer deny the strength that had kept him alive where many would have fallen. The boy's heart wrestled with the memory of those mocking voices. He remembered the sting of laughter, the ache of loneliness, the cold nights where he wondered if he would ever matter. But now, in the warmth of the fire and under the chief's steady gaze, he began to understand that those wounds were not chains. They were proof. Proof that he had endured when the world tried to erase him. Proof that his survival was its own kind of victory. The chief, watching him in silence, finally spoke words that seemed meant for the entire tribe. "You call him weak because of his rags," he said, his tone calm but cutting. "But what man among you has carried hunger and still stood? What man among you has faced rejection and still returned? That is not weakness. That is strength you have forgotten." His words silenced even the boldest critics, for none could answer without exposing the fragility of their own pride. And so, under the blanket of stars, the boy felt something shift inside him. He was no longer defined by the laughter of men who could not see. He was defined by the strength that had brought him to this fire, by the hand of the chief that rested firmly on his shoulder, and by the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. He was no longer just surviving. He was becoming. The days that followed carried whispers that spread far beyond the tribe. Travelers spoke of the boy who had been mocked by cowboys and yet, by sunrise, had been claimed as the chief's son. The story grew with each telling, passed through dusty saloons, across campfires, and into the ears of strangers who marveled at its weight. Some called it madness, others called it mercy, but all agreed it was unforgettable. For the boy, each dawn felt like a new beginning. He walked the same streets where he had once been shoved aside, but now the stares no longer pierced him. Some still sneered, but others lowered their eyes in silence, unable to erase the chief's decree. His rags remained, yet they no longer clung as shame. They were the evidence of a journey that had carried him from scorn to recognition, from exile to belonging. The chief treated him not as a symbol, but as family. He spoke to him, guided him, and stood beside him as if the bond had been there all along. And with every passing day, the boy began to believe the word son more fully. It was no longer a fragile title whispered at dawn. It was a truth carved into his very being. The cowboys, though proud, could not escape the lesson that had been set before them. Their laughter had failed to break him. Their rejection had only revealed his strength. And now, the one they scorned stood taller than them, not by wealth or weapon, but by the hand of man who chose to see what they could not. Their pride bent under the weight of that truth, and their silence became its own admission of defeat. In the end, the boy's story was not about rags or riches, nor about mockery or titles. It was about resilience, about enduring when the world insists you are nothing, and rising when no one believes you can. The Old West would remember him not as the child in torn clothes, but as the son who was chosen at sunrise, when mercy triumphed over pride and dignity was born from the dust. The boy who entered the night mocked and dismissed did not remain the same by morning. Through rejection, he had been forged like iron in fire, and through recognition, he discovered a truth stronger than any weapon, that dignity does not come from what the world gives, but from what the heart endures. When the chief called him son, it was not merely a title, but the rewriting of an entire life. What others had tried to erase, one word restored. This story reminds us that the measure of a person is not found in riches, in titles, or in the applause of the crowd. True worth is revealed in the resilience to keep walking when every door is shut, to keep standing when every laugh is against you. The boy was not chosen because he was perfect. He was chosen because he had survived, because he carried scars that told a story of strength the world had overlooked. The cowboys who once mocked him were forced to confront the emptiness of their pride. Their laughter, once sharp, dissolved into silence when faced with the weight of truth. And that silence carried a lesson that lingers still. The loudest voices are not always the strongest, and the one dismissed as nothing may carry the spirit capable of changing everything. The chief's choice was more than an act of compassion. It was a declaration that power lies not in crushing the weak, but in lifting them. And that is why this story endures. It challenges us to ask, how often do we overlook the ones who stand right before us, hidden beneath rags of circumstance, carrying a fire that no ridicule can extinguish? The boy's journey forces us to see that greatness is often wrapped in humility, waiting for someone to call it by its true name. If this story touched you, let it continue beyond this moment. Subscribe to the channel to keep walking with us through tales that stir the heart. Leave a like if this lesson spoke to your soul, and share in the comments what this story meant to you. Together, we keep these voices alive, ensuring that the boy once rejected is remembered forever, not in rags, but as a sun claimed at sunrise.